The winter of 1944 descended upon the Ardennes forest of Belgium, with a cruelty that seemed almost biblical in its intensity, transforming the landscape into a frozen hell, where American soldiers huddled in foxholes carved from earth, as hard as concrete. End quote. Their breath-forming clouds of ice crystals in air so cold that rifle bolts froze, and men lost fingers and toes to frostbite even before the first German shell exploded among them. It was December, and Hitler had launched his last great gamble in the West, a massive surprise offensive that caught American forces completely off guard and threatened to split the Allied armies in two, to capture the vital supply port of Antwerp and to prolong the war for months or even years beyond what anyone had anticipated. At the center of this desperate struggle was the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a critical road junction where the 101st Airborne Division and attached units found themselves completely surrounded by German forces, outnumbered and outgunned, running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, yet refusing to surrender despite the seemingly hopeless situation. Into this crisis rode General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army, a man whose reputation for aggressive warfare was matched only by his unwavering belief in divine providence and the power of prayer. What Patton did before launching his relief attack toward Bastogne, the prayers he offered, and the faith he demonstrated became inseparable from the story of the battle itself. And when German prisoners of war learned the details of how Patton had explicitly invoked God's blessing before smashing through their lines to relieve the surrounded Americans, they found themselves confronted with an enemy commander who combined modern mechanized warfare with an almost medieval certainty that God fought on his side and that victory was assured, because heaven itself had sanctioned his mission. To understand the significance of Patton's prayers before the Bastogne relief operation, we must understand both the military situation and Patton's unique relationship with faith, warfare, and divine intervention. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born into American military aristocracy in 1885, descended from a long line of soldiers stretching back to the Revolutionary War. He was educated at the Virginia Military Institute in West Point, where he absorbed not just military tactics and strategy, but a romantic vision of warfare as the highest expression of masculine virtue and national greatness. Patton was a complex man, full of contradictions that somehow coexisted without destroying each other. He was profane yet deeply religious, brutal yet sentimental, intellectually sophisticated yet capable of shocking crudity. He read classical literature and military history voraciously, wrote poetry, believed in reincarnation, and claimed to remember fighting in previous lives as a Roman legionnaire and a Napoleonic cavalryman. He attended church regularly, prayed often and publicly, and genuinely believed that God had chosen him for military greatness, that divine providence guided his decisions and protected his forces. This religious conviction was not superficial or merely conventional. Patton believed with absolute certainty that God was actively involved in human affairs, particularly in warfare, and that prayer was an effective tool for obtaining divine assistance. He prayed before every major operation of his career. He credited God with his victories. He saw no contradiction between his Christian faith and his love of warfare, his enthusiasm for killing the enemy, his aggressive pursuit of combat. In Patton's theology, which was idiosyncratic and not necessarily aligned with any formal denominational teaching, God rewarded courage, aggression, and determination. God favored those who acted boldly and decisively. Prayer was not a substitute for action, but a complement to it, a way of aligning human will with divine purpose and ensuring that one's efforts would be blessed with success. By December 1944, Patton had established himself as America's most successful and aggressive combat commander in Europe. His Third Army had driven across France at unprecedented speed following the Normandy breakout, covering hundreds of miles in weeks, liberating vast territories and destroying or capturing enormous numbers of German troops. Patton's forces were positioned along the German border, preparing for a major offensive into the Saar region, when Hitler launched his surprise attack through the Ardennes on December 16th. The German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, smashing through thinly held American positions and driving deep into Allied-held territory. American units were surrounded, overrun, or forced into desperate retreats. The weather was terrible, with heavy snow, freezing temperatures, and persistent fog that grounded Allied aircraft and neutralized the air superiority that had become America's decisive advantage. Within days of the German attack, Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to an emergency meeting. The situation was critical. German forces had penetrated 40 miles into American lines, creating a massive bulge that threatened to reach the Meuse River. At the center of the German advance was Bastogne, a town whose importance far exceeded its size. Bastogne sat at the junction of 7 major roads, and whoever controlled it, controlled movement throughout the region. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been rushed to Bastogne and was now surrounded by German forces. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would have unrestricted access to the road network and could drive toward Antwerp. If Bastogne held, German movements would be constrained and their offensive might stall. At the meeting, Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked how quickly Third Army could disengage from its brand. Current operations: wheel 90 degrees to the north and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration to relieve Bastogne. Most commanders would have requested a week or more to plan and execute such a complex maneuver. Patton, who had anticipated this exact requirement and had already ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans, responded that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals in the room were skeptical. What Patton was proposing was extraordinarily difficult, requiring him to move hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and mountains of supplies across icy roads in the middle of winter, then immediately launch a major offensive against a determined enemy. Most military professionals considered it impossible. Patton was not joking. He had already made his decision, had already begun the process in his mind, and had already, in his own way, sought divine approval and assistance. Before leaving for the meeting with Eisenhower, Patton had prayed. After returning from the meeting and issuing the preliminary orders that would set Third Army in motion, Patton prayed again. As the movement began and his divisions started their difficult march north through snow and ice, Patton continued to pray. He prayed in his personal quarters. He prayed in his jeep as he drove to forward positions. He prayed in churches when he had the opportunity. His prayers were direct and unambiguous. He asked God to grant good weather so his aircraft could fly. He asked God to guide his forces to victory. He asked God to protect his soldiers and to destroy his enemies. These were not gentle, meditative prayers asking for wisdom or peace. These were warriors' prayers, demanding divine intervention in human affairs, asking God to take sides in a war between nations and to ensure that the righteous side, which Patton never doubted, was America, would triumph. The most famous of these prayers was the weather prayer that Patton had distributed to all of Third Army just weeks earlier. But before the actual attack to relieve Bastogne, Patton engaged in additional prayer that was more personal and more specific to the operation at hand. On the night before Third Army launched its offensive, December 21, 1944, Patton gathered his senior staff officers and made a statement that combined military briefing with religious invocation. He told his commanders that they were about to undertake one of the most difficult operations in military history, that the odds were against them, that the weather was terrible and the enemy was strong, but that he had absolute confidence in success, because God was on their side and would grant them victory. He explicitly stated that he had been praying for success, and that he expected his officers and men to pray as well. This was not merely encouraging soldiers to pray individually as many commanders did. This was Patton systematically incorporating prayer into his operational planning, treating it as a force multiplier equivalent to artillery support or air cover. Patton's approach to prayer before Bastogne reflected his unique theology of warfare. He believed that God rewarded aggressive action, that sitting passively and waiting for the enemy to act was both militarily unsound and spiritually wrong. By attacking immediately, by taking the initiative, despite the terrible weather and difficult circumstances, Patton believed he was aligning himself with God's will. God help those who help themselves, and the way to help yourself in war was to attack the enemy as hard and as fast as possible. Patton's prayers before Bastogne were therefore not prayers for divine intervention to save him from danger, but prayers for divine blessing on an offensive he had already decided to launch. He was not asking God whether to attack. He was informing God that he was attacking and requesting divine assistance in the enterprise. The attack began on December 22, 1944, with 3 divisions of Patton's Third Army driving north into the southern flank of the German penetration. The weather remained terrible. Roads were icy, visibility was poor, and temperatures were well below freezing. But Patton's forces moved with remarkable speed and coordination, demonstrating the superb training and leadership that characterized Third Army. The Germans, who had not expected an American counterattack so quickly or from this direction, struggled to respond. Patton's tank columns, supported by infantry and artillery, smashed through German defensive positions, advancing several miles each day despite the conditions. Meanwhile, at Bastogne, the surrounded Americans were fighting desperately. The 101st Airborne and attached units, totaling about 18,000 men, were outnumbered by the German forces surrounding them, but held superior defensive positions and maintained excellent morale despite their desperate situation. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to General McAuliffe, demanding that the Americans capitulate or face annihilation. McAuliffe's one-word response, "Nuts," became one of the most famous moments in American military history. The Americans had no intention of surrendering. They would hold until relieved or die trying. Patton's forces continued their advance. The fighting was brutal, with American and German units locked in close combat across frozen fields and through snow-covered forests. Casualties mounted on both sides. German defenders fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that if Bastogne was relieved, the entire offensive might collapse. American soldiers, exhausted from days of continuous combat and movement in terrible weather, pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that thousands of their comrades were surrounded and depending on them. Patton remained personally involved throughout the operation, visiting forward units, urging his commanders to move faster and attack harder. He continued to pray, maintaining his absolute confidence that God was with him and that victory was certain. His force of personality, his unshakable confidence, and his genuine faith had a powerful effect on his subordinates. Even officers and soldiers who did not share Patton's religious convictions found themselves inspired by his certainty. If the old man believed they would succeed, if God himself was on their side, then perhaps they really would break through to Bastogne. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. The fog and clouds cleared, and for the first time in over a week, Allied aircraft could fly. Patton, who had been praying specifically for clear weather, immediately credited divine intervention. He saw the weather break as direct evidence that God had answered his prayers. Hundreds of Allied fighter bombers swarmed into the air, attacking German positions and vehicles with devastating effect. Supply aircraft dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the surrounded troops at Bastogne. Heavy bombers struck German supply lines and reinforcements. The German offensive, which had been making slow progress under cover of fog and clouds, suddenly faced the full weight of Allied air power. Patton's ground forces, now supported by airstrikes, accelerated their advance. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, broke through the German lines surrounding Bastogne and made contact with the defenders. The siege was lifted. The surrounded Americans were saved. German forces in the Bastogne area found themselves under attack from multiple directions and began to withdraw or surrender in large numbers. The entire German offensive, which had come so close to achieving a strategic breakthrough, began to collapse. German prisoners of war taken during the Bastogne relief operation and the subsequent counteroffensive faced a psychologically devastating reality. They had participated in what was supposed to be Germany's great comeback, the offensive that would change the course of the war. They had achieved surprise, driven deep into American lines, surrounded entire American units. For a brief moment it must have seemed like the old days of 1940, when German armies smashed through enemy defenses and captured entire nations in weeks. But then the weather had cleared, Allied aircraft had appeared in overwhelming numbers, and this American General Patton had moved his entire army with impossible speed and smashed through German positions that should have held. The relief of Bastogne was not just a tactical defeat, but a psychological crushing of German hopes. When these German POWs were interrogated and learned the details of Patton's operation, when they discovered that this American general had explicitly prayed for divine intervention and had publicly credited God with the weather break and the subsequent victory, their reactions varied, but were universally troubled. Some dismissed it as American superstition or propaganda. Others, particularly those who were themselves Christian, found it deeply disturbing. The theological implications were uncomfortable. Both Germans and Americans were Christians. Both prayed to the same God. Both asked for victory and protection. Yet the Americans had won decisively, and their commander attributed this victory directly to answered prayer. Did this mean God favored the Americans? Did it mean Germany's cause was unjust? These were dangerous questions that challenged everything German soldiers had been told about their mission and their nation's righteousness. From a purely military perspective, German officers could analyze Patton's success in conventional terms. He had superior numbers, better logistics, overwhelming air support once the weather cleared, and excellent training and leadership. The speed of Third Army's movement, while impressive, was explainable through good staff work and aggressive execution. The weather break was a natural, meteorological phenomenon, not a miracle. But even this rationalistic analysis could not entirely dispel the unsettling fact that Patton had prayed for these exact outcomes, and they had occurred. Coincidence is one thing when it happens occasionally. When it happens repeatedly, as it had throughout Patton's career, when this one general seemed consistently blessed with good fortune and divine favor, it became harder to dismiss. The German soldiers who surrendered after the relief of Bastogne, who became POWs in American camps, had been annihilated not just militarily but psychologically and spiritually. They had been defeated by an enemy who combined superior material resources with absolute moral and spiritual confidence. The Americans did not doubt that their cause was just, that God was on their side, that victory was inevitable because it was righteous. This confidence, embodied most dramatically in Patton, was perhaps as destructive to German morale as any tactical defeat. It suggested that Germany was not just losing militarily, but was morally wrong, that the universe itself, that God himself, opposed what they were fighting for. Patton's prayers before and during the Bastogne operation represented a particular American approach to faith and warfare that German soldiers found difficult to comprehend. American military culture, despite being professional and modern, retained a strong religious component. Chaplains were integrated into every level of the military. Soldiers were encouraged to pray and attend services. Religion was seen not as separate from military duty, but as complementary to it, a source of strength and moral clarity. This stood in contrast to Nazi ideology, which had a complex and often hostile relationship with Christianity. While many German soldiers were individually religious, the Nazi regime promoted a vague Germanic paganism and absolute loyalty to Hitler that left little room for genuine Christian faith. The story of Patton's prayers before Bastogne and the subsequent relief of the surrounded forces became one of the most celebrated episodes of the war in American popular culture. It was retold in newspapers, books, and eventually films, always emphasizing the combination of military brilliance and religious faith that characterized Patton's approach. The narrative was simple and powerful. Patton had prayed, God had answered, and Americans had won. This story served multiple purposes. It boosted morale, reinforced American self-image as a righteous nation fighting for God and freedom, and provided a heroic narrative that made sense of the chaos and horror of combat. For German POWs who encountered this narrative, either during the war or afterward, it was a troubling counterpoint to their own experience. They had fought for a regime that claimed divine destiny, that promised a 1,000-year Reich, that insisted Germany was destined to rule Europe. Yet they had been defeated decisively by an enemy whose generals openly prayed for victory and received it. The contrast between Nazi rhetoric about destiny and Patton's genuine faith was stark. Patton actually believed God was with him and acted on that belief. The Nazis used religious and mystical language as propaganda but served an ideology that was fundamentally anti-Christian. The question of whether prayer actually influenced the outcome of the Bastogne operation is ultimately unanswerable through historical analysis. From a faith perspective, Patton's prayers were efficacious. He prayed, the weather cleared, his forces succeeded, Bastogne was relieved, God answered. From a naturalistic perspective, the weather cleared because of meteorological processes, Third Army succeeded because of superior resources and execution, and Bastogne was relieved because the Germans lacked the strength to both contain the surrounded forces and stop Patton's relief column. Prayer was psychologically important for morale, but did not directly cause any of the pay outcomes. What is historically certain is that Patton prayed extensively before and during the operation, that he publicly credited God with the success, that his faith was genuine and deeply held, and that his soldiers knew about his prayers and were influenced by them. Whether God actually intervened or whether Patton simply possessed the psychological insight to use faith as a tool for leadership and morale, the result was the same. Third Army accomplished an extraordinarily difficult mission under terrible conditions, relieved the surrounded forces at Bastogne, and inflicted a decisive defeat on German forces. German prisoners taken during this operation faced not just military defeat, but the psychological reality that their enemies seemed to have divine favor, that the American general who had destroyed their units had explicitly invoked God's blessing and received it. Patton himself never doubted that his prayers had been answered. He continued to pray before every operation for the rest of the war, continued to credit God with his victories, and maintained his absolute confidence that he was an instrument of divine will. Whether this confidence was justified theologically is a question each person must answer according to their own beliefs. But historically, Patton's faith and his prayers before Bastogne became inseparable from the story of one of the war's most celebrated American victories, a story that confounded and troubled German prisoners of war, who found themselves defeated by an enemy who combined modern mechanized warfare with an ancient certainty that God fought on his side.